What is going on, everybody? Welcome to the BizDad podcast recap episode. Today, I am super thrilled to have the guest backgrounds for all of the amazing guests that I had this year. I'm thrilled to just show you guys a little bit of a window into each and every person that I had on the podcast this year. It was an amazing year with some great interviews. So please enjoy this recap. If you see anybody that you really want to watch the full episode of, jump back in. Take a look at it, listen to the full episode. You'll be thrilled that you did. Like, subscribe, all of that fun stuff. But please enjoy your Christmas, enjoy your New Year's, and we'll see you guys in the next year. What is going on, everybody? Welcome to the BizDad podcast. Thank you so very much for coming in to listen. And I'm really excited to have Daniel Ramsey on the podcast today. Daniel, if you can, go ahead and introduce yourself. Tell us about your family and also your businesses, in your case, not just single business.
Yeah, super excited to be here, Adam. Thanks for having me. Today, I was thinking about what should we talk about? What's the title of this conversation? And I came up with a line. I think it's the $1 billion father, but the apostrophes, $0 required, meaning it's not, you don't have to have money in order to be a great dad. I'm super excited to be here. I own a company called My Outdesk. That's my primary business. It's a staffing business. We have 2,400 people placed with businesses across the U.S. and Canada. And I'm a dad. And most importantly, a husband, a citizen. Like another big deal is I contribute to my community and I run multiple businesses. So a lot of real estate stuff, own some hotels, some commercial spaces, develop. I just closed on that flip. I like doing flips. Because I'm like, real estate is kind of my addiction. My wife makes fun of me when we're at home. I'll be sitting watching TV and I'll be on the MLS looking at houses, and she calls it house porn. Like, I'm just looking through every listing listed. I love my family and I love what I do for a living, and I've spent a lot of time thinking about how to be a great dad.
I love it. Yeah, I love even the little extra title you gave me, the $1 billion father, $0 required. That's awesome. But I may have to steal that, at least for the title of the episode, maybe for more. We'll see. But tell me about what's up?
In the whole podcast, I think $1 Billion Father podcast, I think it's great.
I want to learn a little bit about your history, understand where you came from. For your context, one of the biggest reasons I ask this is, especially for those who have sat back and thought through it, a lot of the things we do as fathers come from what we learned from our fathers, whether that's a good thing or a bad thing. Maybe we learned not to do something, so we don't do it now. But talk us through a little bit about what it was like for you growing up, who your dad was, and like growing up under his leadership.
Yeah, it's pretty interesting because I'm the opposite of what you just explained. And today's conversation is going to be interesting because I grew up in a family that I would describe as poor, scarcity mindset, struggled paycheck to paycheck. My dad was a good dude, meaning he tried to do the right things. But from a father perspective, very early on, I grew up thinking he doesn't have this figured out. He doesn't know what he's doing.
Mm-hmm.
And so I had to look for other role models, people in my world who were great fathers and who were successful. And yeah, it's pretty interesting. My father was a smoker. He passed away when I was 24 at the age of 44. So doctor came in and said, "Hey, you've got something going on in your chest. I think you should stop smoking." And he didn't stop smoking. Then 2 years later, emphysema. Doctor says, "You got to stop smoking." He didn't stop smoking. And so a year later, now he's got cancer. And that was it. Wow. So my father didn't see any of my success. He saw me graduate college, but not build a family, never met my wife. Like all the things that you want from a dad, he just, he didn't have it.
Wow. Now, you mentioned that like early on, you realized you didn't have it figured out. And there's multiple times I walk through life and I go, I have no idea how to be a dad still. I mean, I've got 3 kids, but at the same point, I completely understand where you're coming from. So talk me, like, when did you notice that? And what was your clue that you were like, man, my dad really doesn't know how to be a dad for me?
Interesting. You started out, I also question myself all the time. Am I being a good? And I think that's the first clue that you're a good father, is that like you care and you want to do this thing right. And you're super intentional and you're thoughtful about your kids. That's a clue. And when I was about 7 or 8, my parents moved us to Arizona. And in that move, my father made a lot of mistakes. mistakes that really impacted our family. One of those examples is my mom gave blood when I was 7 or 8 because we needed food to eat. And there was a program where she could get a $20 voucher for food. And so she's giving blood so we can eat that night. And I remember thinking that a father's responsibility is to provide, and mine wasn't.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, it's tough. I knew then that there was something wrong. I didn't know any better though.
Yeah.
That's the truth.
What kind of life did your dad have? Do you know much about your grandfather on that side? What his life was like growing up?
Yeah, it was really tough. His father wasn't there for him either. And I think that's a pattern that repeats. And I think it's a pattern that creates poverty. And that's why I like the $1 billion father title, because it's not really about money, but it's about intention and being there for your kids and really caring. And I don't think my dad had that. And that's why at the beginning I said he was a good dude, because he actually tried. Like he tried, he just didn't know any better. Yeah. Podcasts like this didn't exist. Books didn't exist. Like you just did what your dad did. And even today, generationally, if you think about it, we come from a long line of humans. Did your parents give you a book and say, hey, this is how our family is? Mm-hmm. These are our issues. These are medical issues. This is how you swaddle a baby. No, you just have a baby and you're supposed to just figure it out, which I think is the travesty to being a father, because why isn't there a guide that's passed down generationally? Why aren't there traditions? And so I started like diving into, what do wealthy families do that are different? Guess what? They have guides, they have traditions, they have retreats, they have all these things. And I look back and I'm like, we didn't have any of this as a family. So I've been setting that up for our family.
Yeah, I think I don't know what it is, but that seems to be a large trend in the people that I've been interviewing, the guys that I've been interviewing. I don't know if it's just a GoBundance thing and how we worked out, but it seems to be the guys in our generation have been that breaking point of something terrible going on. My dad's dad died when my dad was like 2, and then he got a stepfather who was the opposite of a good human being, especially to my dad. And so that turned into my dad being very cold and not really knowing how to be a dad. Like he knew how to provide, so he got to that point at least, but that was about it. And I've gotten more close to him now than I ever have before, and I'm blessed to be able to say that I still have him by my side, even though I keep telling him, and hopefully he's listening, I keep telling him to quit freaking smoking, and he's still doing it. It's driving me bonkers. And then to hear your story, it makes it even more like just gotta stop. But I now have gone to a completely different route than he ever did, and I've yet to really figure out, other than my wife, the way I describe it is we all have a wireframe in our brain, right? That was built as we were younger, and everything goes back into that wireframe. That's the view we have on the world, is what was built. And unless sometimes we'll change a few things here and there based off of small conversations, but for the most part, we go back to whatever that wireframe is, which I think is where we get that image of the child being beat by the dad that turns into a dad that beats his child, that turns into a dad, and it's just like this vicious cycle, because that's just what we saw. That's what they know. And for me, my wife came in and completely mangled the entire wireframe of what it means to be financially successful, what it means to provide, what it means to everything. Like it completely changed my thought process. So I'm curious for you, was there a point in your life where you would say that your wireframe got adjusted, right? You noticed that at 7, but obviously at 7, your wireframe still being built. So how was it later on that you knew that's not the life I want? This is how I want to, represent myself in the world, not what I saw, but what I can see in the future.
What's interesting is I'm still breaking down those wireframes. Mm-hmm. And I think that's a constant battle that we all have. And every time my wife says that I'm Daniel 3.0 right now, I started as just Daniel 0.0, which is funny. It's a great conversation because she can see the growth as it's happening, because she's a recipient of the results or the emotions around that growth. Mm-hmm. But looking back as a kid, I was just different. I was super motivated. I was interested in learning. I'm growth oriented. And as a small kid, I just wasn't given anything. But while my father had limitations, he did 2 things. He loved me. That's probably the number one, the best he could. And I could see that. So I had that checkbox. I felt love from him. But number 2, he never gave me anything. And I learned early on that if I wanted to win, I had to work. And if I wanted to work and make more money, I needed to develop. And if I wanted to develop, that meant I had to actually have structure and discipline. And what's wild is it just translates. So from a super young age, I was like, wow, if I can organize my day, I can fit in extra work. If I can fit in extra work, I can earn more money, but I got to get better at this. And so I need to develop that skill set, and I need a skill stack. And so even today, as I'm looking, whether it's my businesses, my personal life, the way I am a father or a husband, I'm just stacking skills. So, when I find out something that's not serving me, meaning I'm not getting what I want in life, I don't blame others. I don't look back to my wireframe. I actually self-reflect and think, what has to change for me to get what I want? What can I do differently? And I think that's a unique thing that's just innate in me that just most people don't have.
Welcome to the BizDad podcast. I am excited to talk to Eric Beach today. He's a veteran, business owner, father. So introduce yourself, your family, and tell us about your businesses.
Sure. My name is Eric Beach. I am 13 years married to a wonderful wife named Jenna, who I call her my lighthouse, and I'm her guest. I'm what lights the lighthouse, and I'm a lamplighter, which that's a whole different can of worms. But we have 2 children, 8-year-old, 9-year-old, just turned 9 in November. So that's new to me. And then a 12-year-old daughter. So 2 daughters, girl dad through and through. Served in the Army in 2003, went to Iraq, got out in 2005, went through some struggles which we can get into.
Tell me about what it was like for you growing up, your father, maybe even your grandfather, so I can understand a little bit about where Eric Beach started.
It's a wonderful story that wasn't wonderful for a long time. I was not terribly abused by my father, but I was not connected to him. He had a big temper, traumas from his father who beat him with the metal end of the belt and things like that. He named his twin brother Dudley because he was a dud. And so there's these just terrible, maybe they don't look horrible in the grand scheme of tragedy in the world, but they create this narrative of diminishment. And we mask over those things with big emotions and coping mechanisms, but we don't realize that's what they are. And Carl Jung said, if we don't make the unconscious conscious, it'll control our lives and we'll call it fate. Yeah. This is just who I am. Damn it. Yeah. That was my dad's favorite. You people just need to love me as I am. And I'm like, man, that sucks. I was always afraid of him. He was the kindest, funniest, goofiest guy. But because I was so scared of him, it was hard for me to see the great man he was beneath all of that. My wife has said, you don't really see PTSD unless you're in the house with the veteran. This was the same with my dad. People would tell me how you're so lucky to have him. He's like the kindest, most servant-based man. And I'm like, you don't know. I made key decisions to prevent myself from being around him as much as possible. Lots of reasons for it. Were they correct? Probably not. But it's what I did. I regret now. He passed away 10 years ago. I have regrets with him because I didn't get to know him. I didn't get to know all of the greatness that he was because I was so protecting myself from the fear that I had about saying the wrong thing, doing the wrong thing, and calling down his wrath. I would rather shrink away and let it pass. And there were moments later in life where I started getting glimpses of who he was through what his father did and his traumas of the generations. And stories like my dad had a big booming voice. He used to sing opera, not well, but he would do it goofy, but he loved it. He loved opera. And he would just be silly when cooking. I cherish that. It's one of the few things I can really be like, oh, Dad. Then I learned a story about when he was in elementary school, Catholic school. The nuns were getting ready for a Christmas concert. Listened to him sing. They told him he wasn't allowed to sing because he wasn't good enough. So he needed to lip sync and never stop. Even in church, he would just mumble. He wanted to sing badly, but he couldn't let himself. Because of that decision, he didn't go on paths that he needed to go on because he wasn't allowed to give that creative energy expression. So it turns into something toxic and poisonous and comes out as violence. He used his voice for powerful or destructive things. It's because his gift was not allowed to flourish. And so I can see that now, and through speaking to you today and being passionate in every area of my life, believing I can pursue creative greatness, I redeem him. When I go to Ironman, when I would do that, he loved cycling. I hated it when I was a kid because that's what my dad did. But now I got to be an adult and redeemed him through going to France, riding Ironman France, where the Tour de France, he watched every year, annoyed me. I got to ride those courses after he passed away, feel anger in the mountains and at my father, and I got to feel him yell at me, and I got to ask him why. And it's only when you get to those places of extreme exhaustion that you can have those spiritual moments and those conversations and then keep going instead of rolling over and walking away. I got to strengthen myself and through that, see who he was in his purest, his fundamental core, powerful and good. The world stacked a bunch of traumas on top of him to diminish him under the rubble of chaos, of confusion, of an identity crisis, where he was never able to live his life as himself. And that breaks my heart. The regret is, I think, see him in his fullness. I see it now to generations, and I get to stop it. I get to show my children a different path and a different father. I homeschool them because I want them to understand these lessons. And when they were in school, that compression was already beginning early elementary, and I did not like it. It might be good for some, but not everyone. And there has to be other paths. And I am just passionate about taking each individual as an individual and deciding and helping them decide what path is right for you. How do you protect who you are like my dad couldn't, and now I can? That's basically what it was with him. I love him, but I didn't for a long time.
I had a similar feeling with my dad, trying to know who he was, and he grew up in a terrible household with a terrible stepfather as well. The stepfather, I used to pat him on his head every day every time we'd visit, I'd pat him on his head and say, "See you later, Grandpa." The last time I ever talked to him was when he said, "If you touch my head again, I'll break your arm." At that age, I was young enough to be patting Grandpa on the head. Looking back, knowing what my dad went through and having more conversations with my dad and having a door opening into what that looked like, I could say, wow, like that should have been an example to me to understand where he came from. But of course, at that age, there was no understanding that. And I didn't analyze that further until like much longer. I want to ask you, when did you start to realize that's, and I'm looking forward to this because you've already gone down this path a lot mentally. So I'm hoping we can tear into this a lot for anybody listening who hasn't done this, to analyze who their dad is or where they came from, especially those holding animus against their father. When did you start to understand the life your dad had growing up that led to what he did with you?
I think the military brought that on. He told me everyone should spend 2 years in the military. He was drafted in Vietnam, and that stuck with me. When I went to the military, I came back from Iraq, and that was the only time I remember him embracing me and saying, "I'm so proud of you." I remember that found a way into my heart. And it was a moment of, this is what I want, a relationship with my father. What a child doesn't, I think that's pretty universal. But what's blocking me from it? And that's where I started loosely dipping into. That felt so good. It was from such a pure place. Maybe going to war isn't what you want to be proud of your son for. It's a confusing place, but he was proud of me, and that's what mattered. Then I started to see qualities in myself that were him. I used to hate those things. Like, I can't be that. I can't ever do that because that's what my dad did. If I do that, then I'm just like my dad. And I'm like, yeah, but I'm only looking at the bad things. Like, I don't want to yell at my kids, even though I don't want to make them feel scared. So now I apologize every time I step out of line and I get reactive. I never knew that from my dad. I never knew he was sorry. He always told me he wasn't. We never had that conversation. I never knew what he thought of me. My kids know what I think of them. They know it's not their fault. If I look at all these bad things that I don't want in me, I have to accept that the good things that were him are in me too. And so what are those? And what I found was I was doing the exact opposite of all his goodness. He was a servant. He volunteered every day at the Humane Society after he retired. He was incredibly good with finances. He took care of our family. I was living paycheck to paycheck. I was serving myself through drugs and alcohol. I was seeking comfort. He sought discomfort at every turn. He'd go on a camping trip and he spent 5-6 hours cleaning the tarps when we'd come home. And I'm like, geez, give it a rest. He would make me wash all the rocks on our property all summer to do. And I just hated it. And I was like, as soon as I get a chance, I'm not doing any of this, because he was so meticulous and so disciplined. He would do exercises in the living room. So I stopped doing all exercises and ballooned my weight up, didn't take care of myself. I was doing everything he would do that was good. I wasn't doing any of it. So I was only doing the bad things. And when I realized that, if I'm avoiding the bad, well, what happens if I look at the good? And then I realize, holy hell, I'm my dad. But I get to redeem all the best parts of him. As I do that, I get closer to fulfillment, peace, happiness, and joy.
So it started, you said, coming back from Iraq. How did you walk down that path? That doesn't sound like a quick embrace, and then you went to understanding kind of the good or the bad of your father. But how did you start to learn and analyze? Because that takes a lot of self-reflection of sitting down that 99% of people do not do. What caused the self-reflection and analysis of your father?
That was 2004 when that happened.
Mm-hmm.
I get out in 2005. It was an impact moment in 2004. I catalog these things unconsciously. Intense moments stand out, whether good or bad. You're cataloging all these life experiences. That happens as one of them. Then I get out, I'm lost, not even thinking about my dad in that way, because I know I'm right. To medicate, drugs and alcohol, losing jobs, just doing that whole thing. And in 2000, I attempt suicide. And that was, 4 years after that moment of redemption calling to me. You still can't answer the phone. Like, you don't know what these moments are. I just now, in hindsight, know they're universal messages that if we care to understand, we can. They didn't leave me. I go to rehab, I get out, and I still don't change that part of my life. I'm trying to get cleaner by not putting drug dealers in my phone. I get moved to a different city as my parents leave, and I start making better choices here and there, but not with family. And it starts to be this thing where as I do one thing different, I do another thing. And that opened me up to meeting my wife. I had used cocaine a week before I met her at church. And then I was done because she showed me something beautiful. She pursued me when I was at my most broken, where people used to run away. She reflected this to me, opened my mind, and she saw my hurts and she challenged me. I started to pursue healing in 2009 because I'd been to therapy, but 2009 was my dedication to healing. And service dogs, going to Save a warrior healing programs, things like that, starting triathlon. I'm starting to do all of these things, still not really addressing my father, but trying to think about and learn. As you get to a certain age, maybe 25 or older, you start to be curious about your heritage. And that's where you learn the lessons about the belt, about the commons. I just learned about my uncle this year. So I'm still learning about the heritage of the family, the lineage. And so you start to stack these and it starts to shift perspectives. And then at Disabled Veteran, when I got my service dog, my mind was completely open to the spiritual world of this, that we are not our vocation. We're not our name. Am I now me? Or when I'm 75 and I look in the mirror, am I still me? Or because my face looks different, am I no longer me? No, I'm the observer of my reality, the storyteller. It just shifted the way I looked at the world. And as you heal certain things, you can get breath and look at the really difficult things, like that relationship with father, like the abuse of men. You start to see patterns, like replicating this relationship with my dad with other men. And when you finally get to that place where you can look at it after 10, 15 years of work, not until a year or two ago did I get to this place. So from 2004 to 2021, I wasn't there.
Yeah.
But I had cataloged enough information through conversation. In 2014, I was still suicidal and had a plan. My wife found out about it. That was a big moment too. 10 years after that hug from my father, I wasn't better. I just had cataloged an impact moment that would serve me later when I finally got ready to heal, when I finally got ready to look at it.
Welcome to the BizDad podcast. I have Anthony Vigilante with me. Please introduce yourself. Tell us about your family and your business.
Thank you, Adam. I appreciate you having me on today. My name is Anthony Vigilante, and I am a dad first and foremost. I've been intentional about that, especially over the last few years. And I think that's something you learn. Being a dad, of course, you don't wake up one day and say, I know how to be a dad. It's something that doesn't come natural to most people, but I think it's something like other things in our life, we need to continue to keep working on. And that's what I do. I keep trying to be a better dad tomorrow than I am today. And so that's my focus, and that's what being intentional is all about. So I have a son, he's 13, my daughter is 16. So awesome ages, a lot of fun. From my perspective as a dad, the first couple of years are really hard. Then they know who you are and they get a personality and becomes super fun. And as far as I'm concerned, it's been awesome and fun from then till now. I hear the high school years get a little crazy, so I'm a couple of years into it with my daughter, and so far so good, but I keep waiting for the super craziness to start, which I'm sure it will.
I'm married. My wife is Dina. We've been married for 20 years this year. And of course, that's also something that needs work, and we do it happily, and we work at it every day. And so that's my family life. I have some also extended family, my mom and my sister, cousins, uncles and aunts that I really try to do my best to stay in touch with.
I want to rewind a little bit. I've got a couple questions, but I want to start a little bit and rewind and learn what it was like for Anthony growing up, what kind of family you came from, your upbringing, your parents, just to learn more about your background.
Sure. My dad, this is like a counseling session.
You can lay down on the couch.
Yes, I will. Where's my tissues? It all comes back to mom and dad, right? My dad was a great role model. All I do is basically the opposite of what my dad did. He tried his best, but it wasn't easy. My parents immigrated from Italy, married in Italy, came here at a young age. My dad came with nothing, moved to Newark, New Jersey. It's not the greatest city in this country to this day. And that's where they immigrated. And he struggled most of his life to make a few bucks. He worked in a factory his whole life, same place till he retired. He tried his best to start it when I was little in apartments, and then saved up somehow to buy us a house. And that was basically my childhood, but not much of a dad, never there for me or my brother or my sister. Old school. His role as a dad was to work and save money. And that's what he did. Never really had a conversation with him. Probably had a tough life, under a lot of stress, putting food on the tables. The only conversations I had with him were not good. I played sports as a kid, where he never came to a game, never showed up at a practice. I just walked or drove my bike to practices and games, and my parents never showed up. That's how it was back then. Never threw a ball in the backyard. None of those stories. He didn't connect with myself or sister. It is what it is. My mom, she always was more loving, and she tried her best. And between trying to keep him away from us from a angry perspective, fighting, to doing her best to show us love, she was under her own stresses and trying to figure out things. So that kind of really sums it up. And my dad ended up leaving before I went into high school. I didn't talk to my dad for 20 years. Well, when he left, I didn't reconnect until I had my daughter. And I was like, I have kids now. What am I going to say to them when they ask, where's grandpa? Probably it's time for me to reconnect. So it was about 20 years. And I finally reconnected with my dad, which was nice because I got to spend time with him and reconnect with him before he passed a few years ago. And more importantly, I got to reconnect with that whole side of the family. It was nice to reconnect with all of my cousins, my uncles, my aunts from my father's side of the family, and which we did. It was awesome. I still have a solid relationship with I got to see my grandmother again before she passed. I got to obviously my dad before he passed. And now I still go to dinner and have fun with my cousins, uncles, and aunts. There were lost years in there.
I had a similar conversation with Sergio Altamare. His parents immigrated from Italy. Similar story and connection with the dad. And I often wonder if it's just the heartache you had to have seen to cause yourself to immigrate to another country, and then to start completely over in a country you don't know the language, you don't know what's going on, you don't know anything about it, you're trying to build something brand new, like the stress that would put on you and the extra for the kids. There's got to be something to that dynamic that makes it difficult. I don't want to just say maybe it's an Italian thing, but an Italian immigrant thing probably makes sense. Like immigrants as a whole, there's a lot involved. As you were reconnecting with him, what thoughts did you have? How did you justify both properly and improperly what happened and what you felt you missed out on?
Sergio, great guy and a great dad. Reconnecting was interesting. I wanted some recognition of what we didn't have and went through. That didn't happen. We pretended. I took his lead. He pretended that nothing, it was all good, that time never went by, that we never talked about. There was physical abuse as well. So don't really feel like getting all into it, but we never talked about it. I was hoping for closure. I did not initiate it. He did. I didn't want him to spend years with him, like rehashing old times. We had conversations. Having him connect with my kids was nice. Having him meet my wife was nice. All of those things I think were really important. We did not have an opportunity to talk about the past, recreated history. I'm not looking to have this person suffer. He was older at this point, right? The last few years of his life. I didn't need to go there. It was nice enough that he was there. We reconnected. More importantly, I reconnected with other family members.
There came a time for me of understanding who my dad was that helped me figure out the holes I was missing. There were holes he was missing and wasn't able to give to me. So it was a weird self-reflection on my expectations versus reality. Like, it's only reality in a context that we're able to put into our brain. Otherwise, it's not. I'm curious, and I'm not trying to make this a therapy session. It's good to dig into these things. Did you put thought into why he was doing what he was doing, or did you put it as to the story maybe he was telling himself? You were almost implying that he created already another story in that gap of when he was gone to when you met him again. Was he creating other stories before that led him to do some things he did? Or how do you think that went down for him?
Yeah, 20 years of not talking to him. I learned to forgive him. At first, I hated him. Then I had sympathy because he had it rough. His dad was rough on him, and he didn't know how to be a dad. Maybe neither did I, but I figured it out and learned it and found real role models and read books and listened to podcasts, did the things I needed to do. Either those resources were not available to him back then, or didn't know how to begin. Maybe he thought that's how it was. Like, men in the 70s and 80s were not as sensitive. I think it wasn't okay to be sensitive like we are now. We're sensitive to our feelings, to other people's feelings, being introspective. I think that's okay. So I forgive him for that. Mm-hmm. But I do think about why he was who he was. He was the oldest of five. His dad went to war, World War II, in Italy against the U.S. and became a prisoner. He never met his dad. His dad was a prisoner of war in Africa in an English prison. When my dad was 7, Italy switched sides. The English and Americans released the Italian prisoners of war. And so that's when my grandfather was released. He went back home. My dad was 7, and he never connected with his dad. He came back, had 4 more kids. And my dad didn't know him. The kid's already 7, right? His dad probably didn't, I'm guessing, try to connect with my dad and just connect it with the other 4, which were 2 boys and 2 girls. My dad was left out. Being the oldest, he had to act like a dad. As soon as he turned 17, his parents shipped him off to the U.S. to start a life for us. My dad was the first one to come to this country by himself with no money, didn't know anybody, did not speak English. All we had was a family member in Brooklyn. He showed up on their doorstep. They're like, "Who the hell are you?" He had no money. He was 17. He ate hungry, just a pair of clothes he was wearing. And he's, "Oh, I'm cousin Generoso." And they go, "Look, I can't even feed my kids. Move on." He called his parents in Italy. My grandma was like, "I have a second cousin in West Virginia. Go see them." Somehow gets to West Virginia, doesn't speak English, doesn't have money. How scared he must have been at 17. Thinking of my kids now, my daughter's 16. I can imagine that. Anyway, he goes to West Virginia. They're like, "What are you doing here? We have nothing." And West Virginia, it's difficult to live there now. Can you imagine back in the 60s? They're like, "All right, you're going to have to join the military because we can't feed you." I guess once he turned 18, he joined the U.S. military. He learned English, got to eat. He was able to earn a couple bucks, buy some clothes. And then he was writing letters to my mom in Italy. And then that's after the military, went to Italy, married my mom, and then brought my mom back here. I can imagine how rough his childhood was. Rough. Does not compare to what he went through. So that was a realization I had through my adult years. And I'm like, as I pieced the story together, I'm like, wow, that explains why he didn't know how to be a dad. He had no compassion. He didn't have a heart. And he was holding on to he was very frugal, holding on to every dollar, never spent money. Like, we never had anything. Like, Christmas, nothing, no toy. It was like, we had nothing. We never went out to dinner. We did go on one vacation a year to the beach in Wildwood, New Jersey. That was our vacation every year. Even when I got older and had a couple of extra bucks, there was no way he was spending it because he needed to hold on to every dollar.
It's crazy when we look back at what our parents have gone through. Almost everybody I've interviewed on this podcast, anybody who had a semi-rough childhood can look at their dads and realize they had an even rougher childhood. And now we're benefiting for the fact their rough childhood created us to be able to do what we're able to do. It's an odd way of looking at it, but a trend in my conversation with everybody I've had on the podcast. And those with good childhoods, don't get me wrong, like they're obviously doing well. That's why I'm talking to them. It's fun to look at it. They're saying bad times create tough men, create good times, create soft men, create bad times. It's the whole circle that would go on. My goal is to have conversations that lead us to not be soft men, but be tough men who have the ability to be soft. And I think that's hopefully what we take from this, is that we want to instill that level of ethic into our kids, that they're striving to continue to grow on top of this and not just enjoy an easy time. I appreciate the backdrop. One more question I want to ask on this. You mentioned when you reconnected with your dad, you didn't get any apology, what you were looking for, but you also didn't seek it. For somebody in a similar situation and they're saying, hey, I'm trying to reconnect with my dad right now, would you recommend they try to have those conversations or let it flow out the way it did?
I think it's situation by situation. If I reconnected with him earlier and he was younger, perhaps. When I reconnected with him, he was already up there in age and not all there mentally.
Yeah.
I don't think I'd be able to have a real conversation with him anyway. He did lose it a little bit. Because of that, I never went there. I don't think I would have gotten anything out of it. I was happy to play the game, pretend, hey, you're the dad, I'm the son, it's great. Hey, hi, how are you? Again, I wasn't looking for really apology. I was looking for an acknowledgement of what I went through. Wish I could have done better, or wish we could have had more of a relationship. Just an acknowledgement of what he put me through, what he put my brother through, what he put my mom through. My sister was younger. She went through it, but not as much. She's 13 years younger. It was hard on her as well because he left and I basically was my sister's dad. She had it rough as well. If your dad is younger when you reconnect, I'd recommend reconnecting no matter how bad it was. I think it is important for yourself and for your dad and for your other members of the family, children or whatever. But yeah, maybe if he was more with it mentally, maybe I would have went there. I don't think I would have gone too aggressive. I would have kept it, but I would have said, let's have a conversation. But we didn't have any real conversations. Still more than I had as a kid. As a kid, we had zero conversations. But the last few years before he passed, we had talked. He had fantasies because he started to lose it. So some of the things he was saying wasn't true. I just went along with it. I was happy to be there for him for his last years. And he died suddenly, a heart attack. I would have parties at my house where I would invite him and all the vigilantes and all the cousins. It was nice to see everyone. He was happy to be part of that. Or my kids would have events, first communions and things like that, and christenings or whatever. And so that was good to get everyone together. We had nice, fun moments before he passed a few years ago.
Yeah, I appreciate that. I think that makes a lot of sense. Everything is case by case, but I know I've talked to multiple people who are struggling on whether or not they even want to reconnect with their dad. You hit the nail on the head. It's always worth it in the long run. Don't have expectations. Look for perfection. Go in open-minded, ready to let go and move forward.
Yeah, have zero expectations. Don't put them on yourself. Don't put them on your dad. Don't bring baggage to it. Just go with your dad. Try to have an open heart, an open mind. Don't go in closed. Wait till you can do that. Some people probably had it worse than I did. I'm sure many people. And your heart's closed for many years like mine was. Once your heart opens up, then it's time. Don't go in with your closed heart because it's just going to make it worse. Yeah. But I do think it's important for us to have that closure because when they pass, or you could pass, someone's going to pass, you're going to regret it. And you're going to be like, maybe I was a little too rough. You owe it to yourself, the universe, you owe it to your kids or whoever. And you'd be surprised who else it affects. Like for me, I didn't imagine that it was going to affect all these other relationships, like my cousins, uncles and aunts. I'm so thankful they're back in my life. It's a beautiful thing. It's your family. Today, I got a text from my cousin. At the end of the day, it's the most important thing.
What is going on, everybody? Welcome to the BizDad podcast. Today, I am very excited to have a conversation with Amuchastegui. He and I, as with a bunch of other people I've talked to on here, are part of GoBundance. I really enjoyed, as a guy who just recently started homeschooling, I loved reading he and his wife's book, a 5-hour school week. It was awesome. Highly recommend it to everybody. Aaron, if you can, introduce yourself, your businesses, your family, and we'll start with that.
Hey man, glad to be back on here. Yes, my name's Aaron Amuchastegui. You nailed that. We got to meet at a GoBundance event in Colorado. I've been a dad for 16 years. Man, I've got 4 kids, the Maddie, Charlotte, Isabel, and Brax.
Let me rewind a little bit just to get some history on you. If you can, tell me a little bit about who was Aaron growing up? Who were your parents? What was it like growing up with your mom and dad, and what kind of life you were living, that type of thing?
Yeah, man. I grew up at a really interesting time. I got to see a whole bunch of different sides. My dad was an entrepreneur, home builder, and my mom was an education worker. She was a teacher, then eventually she became a vice principal, and worked all the way up to assistant superintendent and superintendent. So she did the traditional career path of getting a job and staying in it. And over 30 or 40 years of working in a school district, she promoted to the top of it to become the superintendent. So she had a very stable, steady deal with benefits all the way through. And then my dad was an entrepreneur. And so from that, we saw he would build custom houses, custom homes, hospitals, things like that. And he only built the really nice stuff. So when the economy was great, he would be building these multi-million-dollar custom houses, and he did well. When the economy wasn't, his income would go to zero. Kind of big swings. He taught me a lot about entrepreneurship, taught me a lot about grit. I could tell I got to grow up and find a lot of things later of the lessons he was trying to teach me that didn't make sense when I was a kid that made sense when I became a dad or when I became an adult. But I remember years, all of a sudden, it was like we were doing really well. We're among the wealthy in town. And a couple of years later, the spotted owl shut down lumber in our town. Interest rates went through the roof and people stopped building. And my dad became a door-to-door salesman selling fireplaces. He went from making 6 figures a year to nothing. I had a good upbringing, right? Like I was among the more lucky people with that. I had plenty of complaints and plenty of things that I thought were unfair and all that but when I look back at the odds of where I was born, who I was born to, and having supportive parents, I had all these lessons as a kid where my dad picked me out a little bit different than my siblings. So we'd get snow days, right? So there's so much snow that would fall, they would cancel school. And so when it was snowing, we would be like, oh my gosh, I can't wait for that to happen. We get a snow day, and what do people expect? People expect on a snow day that now we're going to put on our snowsuits and we're going to go sledding all day. And so my siblings get on their snowsuits, go start sledding. My neighbors would start sledding. And my dad would say, go shovel the driveway, shovel the roof. And I'm going to pay you to do it. And I'm like, I don't care if you pay me. I don't want to do it. I want to be out with my friends. He's no, that's okay. You're going to be shoveling the roof. You're going to be doing the hard work first before you get to go play. And there were a lot of examples like that as a kid. And then like during summers, he was a failed developer at the time when he had this hillside that we owned and were maintaining. And summer would hit and the weeds were 20 acres of property where the weeds were 6 feet tall. Here's a weed eater and you just weed eat those fields now. I'm like, why isn't Jenny doing it? Why isn't it Matt doing it? Why can't you have anybody? Hey, I'm going to pay you. I don't care if you're going to pay me. I don't want to do it. And again, I spent my summers doing that. While friends were riding bikes, doing fun stuff. And man, I tell you what, I felt like it was super, super unfair when I was a kid, but that grit and that work ethic helped me become who I am. And I give so much of the credit of my success to things like that. And fast forward to from 2009 to 2012, I had a really good run. I built a business, made a bunch of money during that time. And then 2013, I lost it all, right? For maybe we'll get into the story, maybe not, but I went from making hundreds of thousands a month to zero in debt, applying to be an Uber driver, go to apply to get a job at like the city of Napa as a building inspector. Reminds me of my dad going from running businesses to selling fireplaces door to door. You just do whatever it takes. I've had a bunch of times in my life I had to go, like 1 week my life was great. It was amazing. And the next week I had to go back to doing manual labor. I had to go back to switching back and forth. He led by example with that. And then by putting a lot of kind of work ethic and stuff into me, I knew what it was like to do hard work. I knew what it was like to do hard work for days when you didn't want to do it and having to teach yourself how to like zone out and not think about it. I had a lucky life. It was lucky to have one parent that was an entrepreneur and one that wasn't. to see both sides of that journey. And I think for them, it was a great combination because when his business was down, her income helped support. I think entrepreneurs now tend to go straight to one works and the others stay home. Pros and cons to that. We've had times in our journey when that was a really positive way to do it, but there's no right or wrong way to do this thing. But I learned a bunch from my dad, and then as a fast forward, just while we're on topic of him, man, we had, like any relationship, love-hate relationship again, because he put higher standards on me, higher expectations on me. It helped me with the skills I needed. He died in 2014, 2015. Died suddenly at 64 years old. So he wasn't super young, but like most people are living way past that. My his parents were still alive when he died. My dad passed at 64 and hadn't retired yet. Like for years, he kept saying he was going to, but he kept having one more person say, like, hey, can you build this house for me? He said, if I can make another $50,000 from this, I'll do this and then I'll retire. Now, part of it was he liked it, but the other side is he really wanted to do other stuff with his life. He had booked a 3-month vacation in Hawaii. There was all these things he was going to do and didn't get to do it. Like 3 weeks after he died was when he was supposed to start that vacation. So he was a business owner, but he wasn't really a long-term investor, where when he didn't go to work, the company didn't make money. I learned a lot during that time. I remember thinking life is short. He had a bunch of regrets. When he was dying, then I heard David Osborne on a podcast with Matt Aitchison. And Matt said, hey, David, what are your biggest regrets if you died tomorrow? I don't think I would have any. I've had a pretty good run. I've done this and this. I've done this and this. I would like having two totally different perceptions. My dad passing away with so much regret and stuff he wished he would have done. And another guy who was younger that if I died tomorrow, I'd say I had a pretty good run. And I said, I want to have that story. I want to have that pretty good run. That was when we pulled our kids out of school. That's when we started traveling the world. That's when we started saying, instead of having bucket lists for later, let's see if we can make them happen now. Tomorrow isn't promised.
How did your dad get into entrepreneurship and building houses? Was that something that he got from his dad, or where did that come from?
So he got it from his stepdad. My dad's story was different. He grew up in broken homes, halfway on the streets, seeing lots of drug use, lots of craziness. And he didn't come with much. And then his parents got divorced. Later, his mom married an entrepreneur. And so maybe when he was like, I think 14, 15 years old, he got this new kind of father figure that became the stepdad, the real estate developer, encouraged him to do things, but didn't pay for it, encouraged him to do things. And then my dad became a father when he was really young, became a father at 16. So he's in high school, becomes a father at 16. And then essentially it's like barely being able to graduate from high school. First, he has a job going, trying to support his new family. That was a very different time, like in the 70s. He learned hard work to get out of the crazy situations. He put himself through school, got like a 2-year associate's degree in construction, something like that at the local technical school. And then just started trying to become a builder, developer, work for someone else first. And I think the economy in 2009 forced me from being an employee to an entrepreneur. It was probably similar for him in the 80s. He saw that example, but then also when he first got his degree, he was working for other people. But in the 80s, when all of a sudden it was like, all right, development stopping, selling stuff door to door, I think that's truly when he probably became that entrepreneur. So he used it as a way to make his life better than it was ever going to be before and get out of a hole. And when people said he won't ever be anything, whereas when I grew up, people were like, it was the reverse. I was voted most likely to succeed. And I had this reverse pressure of like almost too much expectation and like, oh, Aaron's going to be amazing. Just look at him. Or my dad had the opposite, where people would see him and be like, he's going to be a loser forever. And then he was able to, like using that chip on his shoulder, he was able to use that for his drive to succeed. Funny, I think how through generations, sometimes the opposite stuff happens.
Yeah.
Right? Like
very much so.
Yeah, he was the guy getting in so much trouble and smoking on the bridge and doing drugs and a parent at 16. Like he was the poster of all the commercials that don't turn out like this. And then he was able to still rebuild and create a great life for himself. And I was the opposite. But the pressure of Aaron's going to do great almost made me screw around more than I was supposed to.
Where do you think he got the drive to turn that around and say, I'm not going to be the guy that you guys are saying I'm going to be? Like, what do you think that came from?
It could have been parenting. He also, man, he lost his best friend when he was 17 years old. His best friend like drowned in front of him. And who knows, right? If that, when we talk about just our other stories right now, like I think there was probably some of that where you start to go like, live life to the fullest. It was him and not me. Like I need to honor that memory some way. But yeah, I think he probably had several turning points that pushed him for drive. And then luckily he was just a naturally smart, hardworking guy that was able to overcome, because that's abnormal, right? When nobody believes in you, it is so much harder to overcome, I think.
When you were growing up, did you have much involvement in the custom home building stuff? Were you involved in understanding what the business was like or how it all worked?
Yeah, I got to see a lot of it. It started with weed eating the lots and then doing cleanup on the job sites. And then even as part of when I first went to school, it was for architecture, because I was doing AutoCAD drafting through high school on projects that he was building and things like that. So I grew up in it. I got to see all sorts of it. And I also remember always just being like, Dad, you should do business like this instead of like this. You should do business like this. And so it reminds me of like new employees that'll come in and say, hey, you should change this in your business and change this in your business. And I remember him going, no, I've tried that. And the reason I do it this way is because of this. I kept thinking I knew so much more than him. And frankly, you learn later, like it just takes time to learn those lessons. So yeah, so I got to grow up in the business, learning all sorts of stuff, seeing kind of the pros and the cons of it. I loved it when things would turn out good and he could drive by things and say, I built that. I thought that was so cool. And you go around town and you go, he built that theater and he built that hospital and he built this. And even when he passed away, that was one of the things we go look around. His signature is all over town.
I am excited to chat with Harvey Yergin today. Even before this call started, he even mentioned some vulnerable information that I'm looking forward to digging into, because I am positive, myself included, there are a lot of us that feel this way. So that if you can, please, Ari, introduce yourself, tell us about your family, and then tell us about your business.
Yep. Harvey Yergin, live in Columbus, Ohio, from Akron, Ohio. I'm 39, knocking on the door of 40. I'll turn 40 this year. I've been married to my wife, Amy, 15 years. I'll be 16 this year. Or not high school sweethearts, college sweethearts. And 3 kids, Brindley, Harvey, and Clara, girl, boy, girl, 13, 10, and 9. And my business, I am an full-time EOS implementer right now, which, if you don't know what EOS is, I essentially help people get more from their business, get what they want from their business so that they can lead better lives. That's what I do day in and day out.
Awesome. I will gladly dig into that a little bit too, because if you just look right there, I've got a little EOS binder.
Oh, I see it.
Right
That's
there.
Yeah,
There it is. I do enjoy EOS. We started implementing last year in our business, at the beginning of 23, and it was a transformational year. And I really look forward to this year being a massively expansive year because of that. All right. So let's dig in a little bit to like your background, who you are, what it's like growing up. Tell me about your dad, and then maybe even your dad's dad, if much history on that.
Yeah. So I'm the oldest of 4 total boys. So I have 3 younger brothers. And my dad was, I say quintessential, but the older I get, the more I realize that my dad was pretty exceptional. And by that, he just seemed to be everywhere all the time. He worked a full-time job. He was very involved in his church, our church. He shooting baskets or playing catch in the cul-de-sac and somehow making it to every sporting event that we ever had, all 4 of us, and most of the time helping coach. I don't know how he did it, but he did it, and it was very rarely any sort of complaint or insight into the way he felt about it. He just seemed to do it pretty easily, and I'm sure it was not easy. There's no way it could have been easy, because I know what parenthood is like right now, and there's no way it was easy. He's an awesome dad. I wish I would have told him that more when I was a kid, but you just don't know what you don't know until you're older and you have some perspective. So, in fact, just today, I wrote a thank you note to him and my mom, just thanking them for the upbringing and the childhood that I had, because I had safety, I had stability, we were middle class, but we had everything we needed. And that's so rare. I feel like when I hear people's stories about the way that they were brought up, And so saying thank you for that, I think, how can you ever really thank or repay your parents? I mean, probably just with the way that you live your life. But speaking of that being a rare situation, both of my parents came from broken homes. So my dad, he, at the age of 9, his dad left him and his family. But he eventually circled back around and got more involved. And I would say I had a decent relationship with my grandpa, and my dad had a better relationship at the end or back half of my grandpa's life. But my dad just told me a story just maybe a couple of years ago. We were actually on a road trip from the Baseball Hall of Fame to Fenway to see a game. And he was describing what the scene and what it felt like. Him as a 9-year-old watching his dad very coldly just pack up his stuff, load his truck up, and take off without even saying goodbye. He didn't gather my dad's sisters and him and sit him on his knee and tell him what was going on and why he was doing it. He just split. And then shortly thereafter came back, got back with my grandma, moved back in. They were in contract to buy a house. My dad was raised in a bad part of Akron, Ohio. They were going to get out of this neighborhood. They were moving to this better neighborhood and this bigger house. And while they're in contract, my grandpa decided he didn't want to do that anymore and canceled the contract and left again. And then I think he was pretty much gone forever. Then just, that's hard stuff. And it's not lost on me that my dad has carried that with him for his entire life and certainly affected the way that he parented us. And the way that it affected the way he parented us is he was overly present. He just was there. That was his way of reversing the trend, was to be there, to be at dinner, to be there in the morning, to tuck us in at night, say prayers with us, to give us lunch money, to go to every sporting event. He did awesome.
That's amazing. That I often talk to people about. It seems like you either follow the same exact trajectory that your parents laid for you, or you run so far away from it to just get away from what you experienced. And it seems your dad very much went to that other side and like making sure that he was present and making sure he was there. And I'm wondering, to bring up what you talked about beforehand, if that is part of the reason. Obviously, before we started recording, so nobody else heard this, is you said that you were insecure about your fatherhood. And like it's an ambiguous definition of what fatherhood is and what does that actually mean? What does like true good fatherhood look like? And then you proceeded to talk about how your dad was at every single event. He seemed to be doing everything all at once, all over the place. So I'm wondering if like the image that you have of your dad, is that what you picture as that image of what fatherhood looks like? Or are you like, what sort of image are you trying to chase? Obviously you said it's ambiguous, but what sort of image are you trying to chase?
Yeah, I feel that I've continued in the tradition of being present and involved and prioritizing time with my family and prioritizing not missing even the smallest events, going to practice. I'm going to be there.
Mm-hmm.
And I feel like I am doing a good job at that. I'm modeling what my dad modeled.
Mm-hmm.
I still feel like there's something missing. I feel like there is another level there of connection, or again, ambiguous. I don't know. I can sense it. I can feel it. But in the same way that my dad modeled what I just described, what we never really had was an emotional connection, any sort of connection where if I was dealing with a real meaty problem as a teenager with sex or drugs or something that I thought was an uncomfortable topic, me and my dad's relationship was not where I could go to him and confide in him and bring this up and really connect on a really deep level.
Mm-hmm.
So all of the great things that he was and did, and that's not to be understated, there's this deeper connection and relationship that I wasn't modeled from my father. And so I feel a little bit inept to attain that now, if it makes sense.
Yeah, I think it does make sense. And that's one thing that I've talked about on the podcast is my dad had a horrendous upbringing. And I always thought I was missing things from my dad, and come to find out he didn't have the ability to give them. So like your dad, it seems, probably didn't have the ability to give you that emotional connection. He never received that. He didn't know how to model that for you. He just knew, I'm going to be there because I had a dad that wasn't, right? When I looked at my dad, and it wasn't until I was much older, like I was in my probably early to mid 30s before I realized, holy crap, like your dad went through a lot of crap. Like his dad died when he was 2, and his stepdad was abusive, and lots of problems going on there. And no wonder my dad didn't have that emotional connection with me. He didn't know what an emotional connection was like that. Like it was completely absent in him. So there wasn't that piece to give. It seems like that just in your reaction to that seems to hit home. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, totally. And this is something like you, I just started to realize and think about and operate from recently. And it was with my mom. I've been mad at my mom for a long time, and it's, who knows why. Part of it is just because you're a dumb 18-year-old kid, and then you grow up, and then you're just carrying resentment. I think my resentment towards my mom was that she just didn't connect with us. She wasn't as involved. All the stories you come up with. Mm-hmm. In reality, fantastic mom. All the things that I said before. But once you learn the story of where she came from, what her upbringing was like, and you realize that the things that you're expecting of her, she didn't actually have the capacity for because she didn't learn it. She wasn't given it. She didn't have an example of that in her life. I read a book called It Didn't Start With You. The whole thing is about this exact topic. I'm not kidding you. When I finished that book, or sometimes in the middle of it, I was overwhelmed with forgiveness. All that anger and resentment I had been carrying just melted away just through that realization, the exact realization that you're talking about.
Tell me more about It Didn't Start With You. What'd you catch from that as you were going through there? Can you hear me?
Yeah, you froze up. Okay. Tell me more about what?
Sorry. The book, It Didn't Start With You. Tell me, what, as you were reading it, what were the points that stuck out to you?
There's a lot in there. And what sticks out right now is just the mindset shift of considering the upbringing that your parents had and what they were equipped to give you when they had the opportunity to give it to you. And it's very likely that the things that you wish they would have given you, they didn't have the capacity for it. And if you trace it back to the way they were raised, you can see why they didn't have the capacity for it. I think there's a lot in that book too about the way that trauma passes down through generations, like even before you're born. I don't know, there's science and stuff in that, but that sort of stuff just passes on. And then it makes it where you start to view your parents as entire people instead of just the parent who did this or didn't do that. Oh yeah, they had parents, they had an upbringing, they've gone through this life too. And it definitely affected the way they parented and are parenting now. And get off your freaking high horse, dude. They didn't have the capacity for it because of the way they were raised, and it's okay. They did the best that they could, and it was pretty damn good.
What would you say are the top 2 or 3 things that you took from your watching your dad that you are now very sure to implement as a dad?
Definitely being present, being there, not missing things. There is an element of family first. My dad was always clearly prioritizing us and my mom over work or anything else. And that's the big stuff.
What is going on, everybody? Welcome to the BizDad podcast. I am super excited to talk to Maddie Aitchison on the podcast today. But Maddie, if you can introduce yourself, tell us about your family and then about your business, please.
Absolutely, man. First off, I am excited to be here. I would say probably one of the most inspiring, challenging, and things that I'm most passionate about in my life is being a dad. I know you share that same sentiment. Love the work that you're doing. I'm Matt Aitchison. I'm 35. I'm based out of Northern California here in Sacramento. I had a little bit of a turbulent start in terms of, I told myself I wanted to be very successful and wealthy and live the life that obviously many people want to live. Mm-hmm. And my audio said one thing and my video and my actions were completely different. That led me to getting expelled from high school. It led me to getting arrested in college. And it wasn't until life really smacked me in the face, I was facing some pretty serious consequences. And I just remember on that one phone call, which was to my pops, he just flat out said, "Hey, I'm not going to bail you out. But that being said, I know who you are, I know what your character is made of, and how you respond to this situation is going to tell me what your life is going to look like going forward. And the beautiful thing is the windshield is a lot bigger than the rear view mirror for a reason. Mm-hmm. And so your past doesn't have to equal your future."
Tell me about your dad, what it was like growing up with him as your dad. And then maybe even if you have like a window into your dad's dad, what it was like for him growing up One of the reasons I often like to ask this question pretty much on every podcast is it opens up a light into who we are and why we do what we do. Oftentimes we either run towards what we saw our parents doing or run far away from what we saw our parents doing, or something along those lines. I'd love some insight from you on what it was like growing up, and tell us about your dad.
Yeah, my parents divorced when I was just around 3 years old. And both my parents were very cordial and kind and respectful to one another, from what most people talk about in terms of horror stories and the kid getting caught in the middle based on two parents fighting. And really, it's the kid that gets impacted. I didn't have that experience. My parents were very encouraging, very supportive. They definitely held me accountable to certain standards and expectations. That being said, my dad was working corporate America for his entire career, and convinced him actually not long ago to follow me into the world of commercial real estate. He's been doing that as a broker for the last 5 or 6 years, which has been awesome. But my dad was just always very open and communicative, very respectful, very hardworking. I come from a family of people that aren't the smartest, fastest, or strongest people, but we're just dogs. We just get in, we work, we check our ego at the door every single day, and we're consistent. And when you do things over a long period of time, my dad's a perfect example of making a very modest salary. And he followed the path of invest conservatively over 30 years, and looks up and all of a sudden he's got a couple $1 million in net worth. If he would have taken more risks, I would have loved to see what he could have created. But he was just one of those people. We're very risk averse. I don't need a lot. We took 1 or 2 vacations a year to celebrate all of the hard work that he had created, and super grateful for that. I definitely had, my dad's one of my best friends. My mom is one of my best friends. My mom works in the other office here. So I got really fortunate in terms of winning the lottery with parents who never told me I couldn't do anything. Anytime I said I wanted to go do something, they encouraged me. They supported me emotionally, spiritually, mentally, sometimes physically. And that's all I could have asked for looking back. And that definitely laid a very strong foundation for how I parent. Both my parents worked their butts off, but they were present parents, and both single parents in a lot of ways with how they were leading their lives. And yet I was never a martyr in the process of them going out and doing the things that they needed to do, which I know not everybody has that type of fortunate situation.
Yeah, no kidding. You definitely beat the statistics on that one for sure, and having 2 parents that were willing to keep fighting for you and cheering you on. What do you think it was between those two that kind of led to that for you? I'm sure there's going to be a person here listening who's getting divorced. Like, what is it that they can do? What is it that you saw in your parents that led them to not go down that path, that bitter path that we see most, a lot of divorces end in, but they were able to actually be there and support you, and you didn't feel that extra pressure?
Yeah, I think when I was staying at one parent's house and staying at the other parent's house, every once in a while you'd hear a little bit of a frustration of this or that. But at the end of the day, they didn't badmouth each other. They didn't cut each other down. When one person was dating another person, they didn't talk bad about who they were very respectful. And I think that's a reflection of our values. One of our family core values is respect. And that's something that they ultimately not only set that standard of what that looked like, but they upheld it consistently over a really long period of time. And as I got older and started to learn more about certain situations or circumstances or things that happened, they did a pretty good job of keeping that in a capacity that it should have been kept in, which didn't bleed into my life, how I felt about my parents, how I felt about myself. So I feel really grateful from that perspective. And if you really do, where I think a lot of these breakdowns do happen is ego gets involved, and it becomes about the person needing validation in their feelings or needing to create some type of drama or stress. When you think about a lot of people who don't do that, right? They say that they're doing something for a particular reason, and here's their intention behind it. My parents' intention was to provide me with a healthy household that allowed me to have the best chance of success in my own life. And that was something that remained a priority. And I felt that. And if it wasn't that, I would have felt that too. So I just felt like my parents were very congruent with what they said and what they did. And that created an environment and a space where respectfully we could all coexist and work together in achieving one common goal, which was raising a productive, healthy, confident young person.
So I'm going to do a slight stab here and say, okay, so you went to that and then you ended up in jail. So,
Yeah.
just curious how those two, what was it that led you to go down the path that you did? Obviously, there's a part of being 19 that you already know everything and you're going to go off and show your parents that you know everything and everybody else that you're cool. But besides the norm, what kind of led to that path, to that wrong door being opened?
Yeah, it's that cliched statement of birds of a feather flock together. And at that time in my life, I was very engaged and active in sports. I was the one token white dude that was playing pretty high level basketball with a lot of my buddies. And I started hanging around them. And a lot of them, unfortunately, came from broken homes. They had older siblings around them that were either doing drugs or stealing or fighting or doing things that through association we got exposed to. And when you are drinking, smoking, and fighting and stealing and doing things like that, you're hanging around those kind of people. I became the 10th person out of that crew of 9. And on the alternative, when I started hanging around GoBundance guys, I also became a byproduct of those conversations, those environments, those types of people. At that time in my life, I was obviously, like you said, very egotistical. I know it all. Nothing can stop me. Really unaccountable person. Learning and navigating my journey as a teenager. And that ultimately led me to getting expelled from high school by getting in a physical altercation. And when I got arrested in college, it was about alcohol and drug and fighting. And ultimately, those were all things that, again, were really incongruent with who I am deep down inside. But it also reflects how easy it is to get influenced and manipulated and pulled into situations if you don't have that kind of discipline or standards or boundaries for yourself, and what those results can lead you to. And it led me to a pretty dark place and time in my life. But it was also probably the best thing that ever happened to me. And I don't regret either of those things happening because they led me. The beauty of life is there's duality to it, right? There's good and there's bad. There's happy, there's sad, there's extreme highs and extreme lows. And I feel that playing on both sides of a lot of coins in life, not just my personal journey of getting in trouble and leading a good life or being a good dad or being a bad dad, right? I've been able to experience, I think, a lot of those things in terms of hardship that have really forced me to make decisions at forks in the road in my life and determine who I want to be and who I say I am and what I want to unlock. And those tough decisions and going to war with yourself in your own mind often are what create the greatest growth opportunities. And so those led me down a path of growth that unlocked a lot, which has really been stepping stones to where I find myself at today.
Awesome. How did your relationship with your dad then turn out after you got out of jail? Was that like a true turning point for you and you realized, boy, I really need to change my atmosphere? Or did it take a little bit longer after that before you figured that out? And how did your relationship go with your dad after that?
I'm a cold turkey guy, man. I'm a pretty extreme dude in the sense of if I'm having a cheat day, dude, I'm stuffing in 6 cinnamon rolls and 10 donuts. And right, like I'm an extreme dude when I do something. And when I make a decision on something and I'm very convicted around it, I become obsessed with it. And so I became obsessed with course correcting my life. I was so scared of what the potential of my life was and was on the trajectory to become that I went the extreme opposite direction. So that was making some very tough decisions with cutting people out of my life, certain friends, that was certain environments that I completely removed myself from, that was certain extracurriculars that I completely eliminated from my life. And so that was a tough time, but it was also a really productive time for me. My life had to get a lot smaller in order for it to get bigger. And I'm a big believer in standards. And I had always said what my standards were, but I'd never really upheld them or lived them to the highest of my own ability. And I remember going to a personal development conference, and one of the quotes that stood out to me was, "I'm a loving person, but my standards are not." And at that point in my life, I was a people pleaser. You know, I didn't want to ruffle feathers. I didn't want to go against the grain. I really wanted that acceptance. And it led me down a path of figuring out how to first accept myself and going down a lot of the woo-woo spiritual type of work that often unlocks a lot of abundance and opportunity for people going forward. But at the same time, I also knew that I needed to uphold certain standards in my life and that I didn't need to be loved by everybody and that I could still love people and create boundaries and standards for myself too. And that created a lot of room for people to get out of my world. And it also created a lot of room for new people to come in that were aligned with those standards, those values. And that affirmed as I got further down that path and the right people started coming into my world and started getting little wins and breadcrumbs along the path of success, started affirming those decisions and that way of living. All it did was just pour gasoline on a little spark inside me at the age of 20, 21 years old that put me on the path that really started my whole entrepreneurial journey.
What is going on, everybody? Welcome to the BizDad podcast. Today, I am excited to talk to Carlos Rovira. Really looking forward to this conversation. Give us a quick background on who you are, tell us about your family, and then tell us about your business.
Yeah, Adam. So happy to be here. Appreciate the time you're giving me. I grew up in Miami, Florida, Cuban household. So my parents were both born in Havana, Cuba, 1960. Early 1960s, they emigrated over to the United States after the Cuban Revolution when communism came to Cuba. My grandparents, which are their parents, basically had to start a new life. So they had to find jobs, they had to build businesses from scratch, whatever they could do to make ends meet is what they had to do. So I very much grew up in this immigrant exile type mentality, lots of scarcity, lots of conservatism, don't waste money, don't do too many risky things. And that sort of has shaped my approach to business. So my wife, the one that didn't want to buy the duplex and then decided that it was a good idea. We got married in 2010, moved into the duplex. We had our first son in 2013. His name is AJ. He's 10 years old. And then in 2016, we had our other son. His name is Ignacio. He's 7 years old today. We have since moved out of that duplex and we sold it for like triple what we bought it for. Since we bought a house in the same neighborhood in Pinecrest and we currently live there.
Tell me a little bit more about your dad, what it was like growing up under him, and then maybe even your dad's dad, if you know any stories about that and how your dad grew up.
Oh, yeah. So we can actually start with my dad's dad. My grandfather, he was very much an entrepreneur. He was a Spaniard from Barcelona. He was Catalan. My grandfather was also born in Barcelona. And my great-grandfather was an entrepreneur. He started a rum company. Back then, in the early 1900s, everybody in Spain would go to Cuba to make their wealth. So he moved to Cuba and he opened a rum company that was very successful and then sold it and retired at the age of 29 back to Barcelona. And that's where he got married, started having kids. And there he became a real estate developer. He's a guy with money. So he's investing, he's doing different things, and he's an entrepreneur. Entrepreneurs can never stop working. He built a building in Barcelona where they lived on one of the floors, and then you would rent out the rest of the building. And that building still stands today. I've visited it multiple times when I go. And it's funny, on the gate, typical Spaniard, he has to put his mark on the building. On the gate, it says his initials, J.R., Jose Rovira, on this iron gate. It's still there. And I take a picture of it every time I go. But he's an entrepreneur. He moved to Barcelona. And then in 1934, I think, or 1936, I believe, there's the Spanish Civil War. So they have to flee Spain. Fascism takes over. And they go back to Cuba. So he goes back to Cuba, again, entrepreneur. So he opens a bunch of different businesses. He gets involved in the rum company again. He opened a movie theater, which is where my grandfather worked. And then in 1960, the revolution comes and they have to flee. They basically have to leave everything behind. I actually went to Cuba a couple of years ago and I visited the movie theater, and it's completely abandoned and it's pretty sad.
Of course.
Yeah. So they come to Miami. And my grandfather actually did not get the entrepreneur bug. He was an electrical engineer, studied at Georgia Tech, and then worked at the theater in Havana after he graduated. Never practiced as an engineer. And when he came to Miami, he actually had a real hard time finding work because they were going to make him like retake a whole bunch of like classes and stuff since he hadn't practiced as an engineer. And imagine you've got 3 kids, you're living in a 1-bedroom apartment. You don't really speak the language that well. And there's a sense of urgency. So he really didn't have time to go back to school, but he had to find work. And he ended up working at a jewelry store at Mayer's, which is a really well-known jewelry store here in Miami, until he retired. But my dad, he did get the entrepreneur, but he started a business. He used to work in a bank. And he told me one time he told me that the day he realized he needed to start his own business was a day that he spent his entire day in meetings. And in banks, they would just sit around having meetings all day, but then they would never do any work. It was just like meeting after meeting, and then nobody would ever do anything. And he vowed to never have a meeting again after he started his own business. So he launched a marble company, basically a stone manufacturing company. So basically they do countertops and flooring and stuff on granite and quartz. And his business actually has done well for us. He has big contracts with the cruise lines. So he does all the stone work on the Carnival cruises and the Royal Caribbean cruises. And those ships, they go through like major beatings on the ocean. So all of the stone and the floors and stuff are like constantly breaking. So every couple of years, they have to take the ships out of like the rotation and completely renovate them. So it's basically never ending work because they have so many ships that are constantly being taken out. But it's done well. He basically has relied very heavily on the cruise lines. And we grew up very much a middle-class family. We didn't have that much wealth, but we always had money because my dad had a good business and we never had a shortage of things. We always had food. We always went on vacations. We went to private schools. We didn't grow up rich, like a very wealthy, lavish family, but it was enough. I also got the entrepreneur bug. I have a hard time working for other people. I tend to get frustrated very quickly, and then I become very defiant and annoying and not a good employee. So that's where the entrepreneur bug came from, is through my dad. But yeah, it's pretty much in a nutshell.
What is going on, everybody? Welcome to the BizDad podcast. Today, I'm really excited to talk to Steve. So Steve, why don't you open us up with an introduction about who you are, tell us about your family and your business.
Yeah, thanks, Adam. Excited to be here. This is my first formal podcast. I did some way back when, so I haven't been doing this since probably 2016. So excited to relaunch my debut into podcasting, but now as a guest, not as a host. Pretty cool. So yeah, my name's Steve Blentlinger. I'm from Chicago, Illinois. Born and raised on a farm. Great family. We get into that. I have two young boys. Colin is my youngest. He's 11. My oldest is Carter's 14. And then my wife, 15 years, Laura and I, we've been married since 2009 and always try to, focus on family first. So that's why I'm excited to get into this podcast. And then on the business side, mostly my career has consisted of the construction industry. So I've spent a lot of time as a project manager in the construction industry, and that's my current main business. So my old boss started a company in 2019 and asked me to join him. So I came on as not really the founder, but came on as partner, if you will, of helping him grow and lead the company. So Redwood Construction, we're a boutique firm, do commercial and high-end real estate, residential projects here in Chicagoland market. And then we've recently also gotten into real estate. So we have tower real estate development. Part of our kind of plan when we got together for starting Redwood was to get more real estate under our belts. We've done a lot of development for other real estate owners and probably looks easier than it is. So we thought we'd jump right into it. So we'll get into that if you want on our foray of doing a development and raising money and all that good stuff. And then that sort of launched into another company that I'm working on outlining a startup for this year that'll be in the industrial small bay flex warehouse type space. So yeah, it's got plenty going on to keep us busy. A ton of activities with kids I'm sure we'll get into, but that's in general who I am.
That's awesome. Yeah, we're definitely going to have to go into a little bit of that. I want to get into a little bit of the history of you and where you're from, right? You said you grew up on a farm. Can you tell us a little bit about your dad, and maybe even your dad's dad, a little bit about how they grew up and what it was like growing up with your dad?
Yeah. So if I have any type of work ethic, it came from my parents for sure. So my dad, he was amazing. He was served in the military and came out of that, worked for Firestone for quite a while, changing tires and as a service station. And then he had the opportunity to move to where my mom was from on a farm in a little county called Brown County in a town called Mount Sterling. Great deer hunting, if anybody ever was interested. Got a lot of great land. Excuse me. So my dad moved there with my mom. They lived in Jacksonville for a while and then started their family. And man, there's one thing they did right. They knew how to grow a family. So I have 4 older brothers and 2 older sisters. They range in age of 20 years older than me to about 10 years older than me, more or less. It was amazing. I grew up with, I'll tell people, like I feel like I had 5 dads and 3 moms sometimes because they were all so much older than me, but it was a good upbringing. You know, I was taught baseball by my older brothers out in the pasture, in balls and trying to catch them. And yeah. And so anyways, my dad was amazing. He was a farmer. At one point while I was young, he also became a night watchman at the local union laborers camp. They had like a training facility. It was maybe a mile or two from my house. And he used to mow their yard. And one day the guy that ran the place came out to him and said, "Hey, I need a night watchman if you know of anybody." And turned out that he ended up hiring my dad. My dad's schedules were insane. He would work and he'd wake up probably like 10, 11, cook breakfast if I was home, or cook lunch or breakfast if I was home for the summer. Then he'd go out on the farm for the rest of the day, and he'd come home maybe 6, 7 o'clock at night, eat dinner, shower up. He'd sleep for an hour or two, whatever he could get in. And then he'd wake up maybe 9 or 10 o'clock and he'd go be a night watchman from 10 or 11 until the next morning. And he'd come home at whatever it was, 6 a.m., make sure my butt was up and getting on the school bus. And yeah, it was during school, and then that was it. So he was the hardest working guy I ever knew. I think a lot of farmers are. It's underappreciated trade, but so yeah, he was great. He was there as much as he could be. We grew up in a pretty strong Catholic family. Sunday church was always something that we did together, and we always were doing church events and things like that. I was blessed enough to have a Catholic grade school that I went to. We didn't have a lot of means to afford private school, but I was lucky enough that I had an older aunt that helped a lot of my siblings and I get into the grade school there. And we had a fairly decent private school or a public school that we went to for high school. And a small town. It's funny, I laugh at it now. It's like my kids' kindergarten class is like the size of my entire high school. But yeah, it was good. It was great upbringing. Like I said, my dad was a great role model, especially in regards to work ethic. And we didn't have a lot, right? We didn't have all the shiny, flashy stuff. My mom and dad always found a way to make sure Christmas and birthdays were always a lot of fun. And I think at some point as I was growing up, maybe when I was reaching my teens, you start to figure out where you are on the social ladder, if you will. Friends that got boats and boat houses. And I was lucky enough to have 2 friends that had boats. So I got to do plenty of that on the Illinois River and in Lake of the Ozarks and things like that. So I had a lot of fun growing up, but we never had the means for that. But again, we always had food on the table. And my mom and dad, they worked hard. We had a garden. So I grew up planting potatoes and hilling potatoes and sweet corn, shucking corn, all that stuff, and a ton of great little memories. And it's interesting because I'm pretty far removed from that now in my comfortable little suburban home. And I married a city slicker, if you will. She's amazing, but there's no way I could get her to move out to a farm these days. Yeah. But, so yeah, it was a great way to be born and raised.
So I'm going to ask a question that I've never asked. Just this is interesting the way I'm trying to frame this in my brain. If you were to go back, so your dad worked a lot, was a hard worker and on multiple different jobs and did different things. And then you have the ability now to sit back and look at how he operated and then how you're operating and the freedoms that both sides provide and the handcuffs that both sides provide. If you were to look like which one of those books in the background that you have up there would have best benefited your dad, or do you think your dad would have most liked and enjoyed?
I think so that's really hard because I don't know that my dad was a avid reader, right?
It's not part of it. This is all conjecture anyways, right? So
yeah. So if I think I can't even think of a book that he read. I mean, I can tell you an interesting story is another lesson learned for kids. I buy Rich Dad, Poor Dad for a bunch of, I'll hand that. I got 4 copies behind this copy. I'll hand it out to people. I'm like, start here. This will make you rethink things. My mom actually bought that book for me when I was probably either going into college or just out of college. And I think I read a little bit of it and, wow, this is just crazy shit. I hung it up. I don't know, though, if that didn't somehow, I don't know that I credit the book to starting my entrepreneurial spirit, but it was right around that same time that I started thinking a little differently about life.
Yeah.
I don't know whether I discredit that. So I do think maybe going back to your question, Dad being as hard of a worker as he was, if he could have pulled out something out of the who, not how concept. And the reason I say that is my dad was the old school. You work hard, you get rewarded. The harder you work, the more you can earn type of person. And it's as hard as he worked, he was always somebody else's who. Even when he did his own thing as a farmer, you're a cog in the wheel unless you can get to where you have employees working for you and you buy more land. And I don't know. I think that book, that concept of maybe having other people do some of the work for him so that he could have done other things that are more important would have been helpful. And probably especially I never unfortunately really got to know my dad's dad, or I didn't know my grandparents very well. My grandma on my mom's side, I was closest with. She was my caretaker growing up, and I spent a lot of time growing up at her house, it's funny because now I think of like the cousins, my kids' cousins. So my wife's family comes over to my house all the time now. Anytime we have holidays, birthdays, anytime we can, we travel with them all the time. I always look at that. I feel like that's a little bit of the way my grandma's house was growing up, except for without the really good home cooking. We just order out. But my grandpa her husband, so my grandpa on my mom's side, he was the original owner of Volk Farms. That was his name. And I think if there was anybody from talking to people who knew him pretty well, if there's anybody that probably could have been an entrepreneur and just didn't because he wasn't afforded the opportunities, or culturally it probably could have been him. He was, I was told he would, calculate if they're, talking about what the cost for, what you get paid for a bushel of corn, or if you're talking about how many bags of seed you need to plant a certain number of acres. He was the guy who could just do those numbers in his head. He just was a smart guy and devoted and good family man. And so from what I understand of him, he probably could have been the entrepreneur in the family. And I don't know if my dad ever got that. I don't know if he ever got that opportunity. But yeah, the work ethic side of it, it could have been amazing if he had been able to instill it. And I thought about that sometimes, like at the family farm, and the boys, some of us could have taken it over and grown it. What could it have been? Yeah. Probably the timing of it wasn't right. It's just such a lack of non-glamour, right? The opposite of a glamorous. Yeah. It's just hard work or a lot of hours. You talk about guys that can't take vacations. Like I remember a couple of family trips. Like we didn't travel when I was young nearly as much as what we do now, today's world. But I remember them just figuring out, okay, who's gonna feed the cows? Who's gonna take care of the pigs? Who's gonna check on the dogs? It was hard to get away for more than a week, or if you tried to get away for 2 weeks, it was almost impossible. That again, if it could have been that who not how, where they had people that worked for him, even if it was just hired hands, that probably could have been something that would have, if my dad could have had the farm, been able to check on an hour a day and still worked as a night watchman, right? Yeah. I honestly, he ended up passing a few years ago and unfortunately had a pretty good bout with Alzheimer's and dementia towards the end of his life. And I read, there's a really cool book, it's not on the bookshelves behind me, but it's called Why We Sleep. And I forget the author's name off the top of my head, but that was one of the more impactful books for me. Because I'd run on 4 or 5 hours of sleep a night and just work and until I crashed. And that book changed my mind a little bit because it talked about the real importance of getting a consistent 6 or 7 hours of consistent sleep and what it does to your performance. If you get 0 hours of sleep, your performance is just like you were intoxicated. If you only get 4 hours of sleep, if you do that over time, it actually ends up that tiredness, you have the same lack of reaction and thought process as you do as if you were partially intoxicated. And another part of the book talks about the potential of, we don't quite understand why we sleep, right? Not fully. And the chemical processes that happen while you sleep can actually rinse your brain of those proteins in a way. And there's a theory that's part of what can lead to Alzheimer's. So I've definitely changed as much as I can. I still have bad nights, but as much as I can, change how much I sleep. And so going back to what my dad was, I do think that was maybe a contributor to some of his, at least maybe he would have gotten it anyways, but maybe accelerated it for him. Yeah. Because he never really slept more than 3-4 hours. And he did it. That's just the life that he did. And he did it because that was hard work and that's what he did to support his family. And that time that he put in working those nights has been transformational for my mom because it was a union labor camp. They ended up enrolling him and getting some benefits. And that's been, huge to my mom and her retirement to get some of those benefits on the backside. Yeah. Anyways, to answer your question in a very long way.
What is going on, everybody? Welcome to the BizDad podcast. Today, I am excited to have Alan Underwood on the call today. Alan, if you can, go ahead and introduce yourself. Tell us about your family and about your businesses, in your case, multiple.
Yeah, thanks, Adam. You hit the big one. Most people, when you say you've got 8 kids, they do a double take and look back and question. And I can certainly remember times when we traveled commercially on airplanes as we walk onto the plane, literally watching people count the kids walking down and wondering what was going on. Yeah, so we've got 8. My oldest will be 24 this year. Yeah, she's married. Her husband's going to school and she's working. He's trying to be a pediatric neurosurgeon, so he's way smarter than me. And my youngest is 8. And we've got the 5 youngest are still at home. We homeschool them and have done that for years, about 10 years of homeschooling, and I absolutely loved the experience of educating our kids at home. My second oldest has his check ride in about a week. So he's, for better or for worse, he's following in my footsteps and becoming a pilot. He says he wants to do that professionally, and I think that'll be awesome. So I'm excited for his journey. My next daughter is a cosmetologist and carving out life on her own terms. It's been awesome to watch them grow and develop and become our friends after being teenagers when they stop being your friend for a little while.
That's what I keep hearing, and I'm not looking forward to those days where they're not wanting to be friends anymore, but we'll see how it goes.
Yeah, you'll survive. And business-wise, I've done a lot of different things. I'm sure we'll explore that. Most recent is a Christian Ballou and I, another co-bro out of San Diego, started a real estate investment fund. And that fund is focused on purchasing single-family homes in San Diego and then adding additional units to them. We're about halfway through our first capital raise. So that's been a huge, exciting, learning adventure. It's stretching and it's just been a blast. And when you have to go to San Diego from Phoenix for work, that's a pretty good problem to have. In the background behind that, I'm working through the entitlement on a 92-unit apartment complex just outside of Phoenix. That's been a project of 3 years that I've been working and battling the city to get done. We've got some commercial properties. I do some single-family flips occasionally. Prior to that, I owned car dealerships. I've owned pizza restaurants. I've done some offshore insurance companies, a bunch of other stuff in between.
Nice. Yeah, that's awesome. I'm sure we'll be able to dig into a bunch of that. Obviously, being a real estate guy myself, I love to be able to chat about that as much as possible. But so I'm curious, what was it like growing up when you were a kid? You had 8 kids. Did you come from a lot of kids as well? And tell me a little bit about your dad and maybe even your dad's dad and what that was like growing up.
Yeah, growing up, so we're a family of 4. So we normal size, and that's, I guess, what I imagined our family would be. And I don't remember ever having that conversation with my wife of like, how many kids are we going to have? And I kept thinking we would be done, and she didn't agree. She came from a family of 10. So we ended up a lot closer to what her growing up experience was. My dad worked for a car dealer and then eventually ended up owning part of that car dealership. And that was, my introduction to cars. And I blame my grandpa for the aviation addiction. He was a master sergeant in the Air Force, stationed all over the place, but primarily at Luke Air Force Base, just outside of Phoenix. And I have a memory of, and I don't know how old I was, but I can remember going with him to the base and him putting me in the cockpit of different airplanes. And I think that's where the bug bit for flying. And it took a lot of years for that to come full circle and for me to get to indulge that passion. But that's where it started. And my grandparents, my dad's dad was fantastic. We just called him Great. That was his nickname. And they were very involved in our lives. We did a lot of woodworking together. I can remember them being very present. My mom's parents were supportive. I don't think we shared as many similarities, I would say. So I wasn't as close to them, but with Great, I was certainly really close and had a great relationship with my dad. Both of them have passed now. I lost my dad. It'll be 4 years in October since we lost him. And my grandpa, I think it's been 12 years.
Wow. All right. That sounds awesome. Luke is one of those places I've been multiple times. I was an Air Force guy as well, and I've been out to Luke multiple times. And when I joined back as an officer, I had to go up there for a bunch of the training and stuff. But there's so many different aircraft that are flying in and out of there all the time. I'd imagine it was a blast as a kid watching that go around. Both of my parents were Air Force, so I was always around Air Force bases and different places, and I loved being able to see it. But my dad was in the Air Force, so I got to see it all the time. What was that kind of, besides like getting in and out of the cockpit, like how often did you get to go to the base, do air shows and all that type of stuff? Was it rather often or not so much?
So he was retired by the time I came around. He joined young and ended up serving in Korea. And then when Vietnam came around, they let him know that they were going to send him to Vietnam. He reminded them that he'd already done one of those tours and wasn't real excited about leaving his kids and doing another one. And they said, we're going to send you anyway. And that's when he let them know that he was retiring. Retired long before. So it wasn't very often that I went with him to the base. I just remember that one trip. But I do remember all growing up, I was always fascinated with airplanes. We went to a lot of air shows, either with my dad, with my grandparents. And then as I had my kids, it's fun now because the plane that I own is based out of Falcon Field in Mesa, Arizona. And when our kids were small, there's a little park that there's literally a chain link fence that divides that park from one of the taxiways at Falcon Field. And I took them there all the time to play so that while I was watching them, I could watch the airplanes take off and land. My wife and I's first date was at the restaurant that's at Falcon Field. And so I never would have imagined on that date or with the kids there that someday I would be going in and out of that airfield all the time and flying in and out of there all the time. So it's funny how those ideas that get implanted at a young age stick. And I think if you allow them to, will show up later in your life.
Yeah. And I think even the bad ideas that get implanted into our brains can show their ugly head later on in life as well. So it can go on both sides of the house.
For sure.
It's something to definitely be aware of as we're growing up and we're analyzing our past. I want to talk a little bit more about your dad too, because you mentioned he worked at a car dealership and then ended up being part owner. How did that end up happening?
Yeah, so my dad initially went to school to become an accountant and graduated from Arizona State University as a CPA, and then started his own accounting firm in a little teeny town. You may know where this is if you're familiar with Luke, at Wickenburg, Arizona. And across the street from his accounting office was a car dealership. And he started doing the books for that car dealership. I guess they liked him, liked his work, so they brought him in-house and were impressed enough with who he was and the work he was doing that eventually he ended up managing that car dealership. And then he received an offer from another dealer group in St. George, Utah, and it was a lot more money. And my parents had always wanted to be in St. George. They loved the weather there. And so we went to St. George when I was 13 years old and spent 2 years. And my dad says that every week that they were there, the previous owner would call him, "Hey, Mike, are you ready to come back?" "Nope, not ready to come back. We like it here." And finally, after 100 phone calls or so, he said, "Hey, if you'll come back, I'll let you buy into the store." And that's when we came back. We didn't go back to Wickenburg. We ended up in Casa Grande, Arizona, about halfway in between Phoenix and Tucson. And that's where I did high school. And from the time I was probably 14 or 15 years old, I was washing cars. When I was 18, the sales manager asked if I wanted to start selling cars instead of washing them. And I didn't really know what that meant, but it sounded like a good idea. So I did it, and he's okay, well, come back tomorrow, wear some nicer clothes than what you're wearing out there on the lot. So I came in, I sold my first car. It was a Ford Windstar minivan, and I had no clue what I was doing. They would just say, "Hey, go say this," and I'd go say that, and I'd come back. And anyway, he says, "Hey, any idea what you made selling that car?" And I had no idea. I was making $6 an hour or something out washing cars. So anything better than that, I thought would be good. And he showed me that I'd made $900, and that hooked me on selling cars. So that's how I put myself through school. and that was hard too, because I'd work half the day and then go up to my classes at ASU. And my friends would be saying things like, man, when I graduate from school, I can make $30,000 or $40,000 a year. And I thought, I'm making that right now, working part-time. This whole college thing may not be the best idea for me. And maybe that's one of those bad ideas that got planted, as I realized there were other paths outside of college that could be where you could find success and make the kind of money that you wanted to make. And it made it hard to stick with school. So you asked about my grandpa, and it's actually a part of that restaurant story where he ties in that I've actually been thinking a lot about this week. And it was, so I went to my grandpa with this idea after I talked to my dad, and I always loved getting advice from my grandpa. And he was, I don't know if it was the military training, just his personality, but he was really good at giving great advice with 2 or 3 words. And so I didn't know it at the time, but I was making my first deal pitch. So I'm explaining this idea to him, and here's how it's going to work, and it's going to be great. I go through the whole thing, and he nods his head a little bit and looks at me, and he goes, that'll never work. And I thought, oh, he didn't understand. So I re-explained, went through it again, and he just shook his head again, and he says, Alan, that'll never work. If you want to be successful in this life, you sell drugs, sex, or religion. And I thought, dang, I'm never going to be successful. I don't know how to sell any of those things.
To a lot of people, food is a drug.
Yeah. And here's the amazing thing. Even though I don't think he believed in the idea, he still supported me. So the first 3 restaurants that we did, he and I built every single table for those restaurants. He built the countertops. We did all the framing, the electrical, the plumbing, the concrete work. We built those all from the ground up, and he was there right alongside me to do all of it. So even though he may not have believed in the idea, he still supported me. And that's something that I've actually thought a lot about with my own kids recently, is maybe I don't see their vision, maybe I don't believe in their dream, but it's not for me to decide what dreams they pursue or what passion they decide to follow. But it is within my power just to support them and to love them. And I don't know why it hasn't been until, like I said, just this week, that lesson has really hit home. There's not really anything going on with my kids where I feel like that lesson was necessary, but I was just feeling a lot of gratitude for the fact that even though he flat out told me this will never work, he worked to support me in making it work. And that says a lot, I think, about who he was.
Maybe that was going on in your head because you're going to be on here, because I think that is a phenomenal point to handle. As you were saying that, I'm thinking through the different things that I talk to my sons about, and they have these ideas, and I instantly go to logic brain. Let's adjust your idea to where it's going to fit better in the world, as opposed to let's run with your idea, whether I think it's a good idea or not. Like I should let them venture off a little bit more and chase those crazy things and be like, hey, you never know. Like, it was a crazy idea to go land on the moon at one point. It was a crazy idea to sit here with a camera in front of my face and talk to somebody from the other side of the country. Welcome to the BizDad podcast. Today, I'm excited to talk to another real estate guy, a dad who loves travel, Chase Calhoun. Looking forward to getting to know you a little bit more. So if you can, Chase, give us an idea of who you are. Tell us about you and your family, and then about your business.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for having me on. Again, my name is Chase Calhoun. We're in Little Rock, Arkansas. We actually relocated here about 6 years ago. So I'm married to my wife, Brenda, and I've got an 11-year-old stepson, Nico, and their baby girl, Aston, who's 11 months old. I'm a real estate investor. That's a majority of what I do. As a part of that, I'm also a licensed general contractor and do a little bit of development. We've specialized in heavier rehab construction projects, and this is part of trying to grow that real estate investment portfolio. So sometimes good or bad, I'm not so sure, but that's what our niche has been. Eventually, I'd like to get maybe away from some of the heavy rehab stuff and into more new construction, but for now, that's what we're good at.
Awesome. Yeah, that heavy rehab stuff, though, it's a whole lot of work up front, but you being a GC, I'm sure that helps out a lot to be able to manage those projects. I've done one very heavy rehab, and it was dreadful because we weren't GCs, and we dealing with the GC and having to go there was just a dreadful experience. But next time I do that, I will be partnering with somebody like you. So,
Even though it was
a rough time.
So I wasn't a general contractor when I started doing this, but it's more of it's become out of necessity because of the same thing. It's been fun and hopefully, but they're very lucrative and it's gone very well for us. But they're a little bit of a headache sometimes.
Yeah, well, I would imagine. Yeah. All right, so I want to rewind a little bit, know where you come from and how you grew up. So if you can, tell me a little bit about what it was like growing up in your family. Tell me about your dad, maybe even your dad's dad, if you much about that side.
Yeah, absolutely. So I was raised in the San Francisco Bay Area in California. So I came from a two-parent household. So my parents are still married to this day, although they've since relocated to Little Rock and here closer by. Growing up, my dad he was in the trades. So he was a painting contractor. He worked full time up until like I was from high school age or whatever. There's a chunk of time where he was working full time. My mom was actually able to stay at home and take care of me and my brother full time. And so again, dad just real hard worker whose adult life doing that now has since retired. And then my grandfather, so his dad was also pretty active in my life when I was younger. My grandparents would pick me up after school and then kind of watch me until both my parents were working until they left work. And so I got to spend a lot of time with him when I was young. So probably up until the age where I was maybe, let's say 10 or 11, 12, when my mom stopped working for a while. And so that was a lot of good time I spent with my grandfather as well.
Okay. So with the father working in the trades and then obviously your mom working on and off until you got into high school, what was your relationship like with your dad as you were growing up?
It's funny because I guess looking back, I hadn't proved a father move, but I think I had a fairly good relationship with my dad. I used to work with him during the summers and stuff. So while I wasn't in school, I would go to work like full time from a pretty young age. I was probably, 8 or 9 when I started going. It wasn't like crazy hard work, but I'd be going and helping out where I could and doing basic stuff around the job site and stuff. I'm sure that's where I guess I picked up a lot of the stuff that I do now, which on the painting side of it. And so we have a pretty good relationship with that kind of stuff. Again, he was during the school year or whatever, he was busy with work, but we still got to spend a fair amount of time doing hunting and fishing and some fun stuff like that as well.
Okay, nice. Yeah, I remember my dad worked a bunch of jobs on and off. Most of them I wasn't able to go with him, but on the side jobs where he'd go, like we were upstate New York and he'd go cut down a bunch of trees and make log wood for folks. And I'd go out and just cut down trees with him. I was probably, like you were saying, 8 or 10 years old, and we'd be running around the woods and I'd be yelling, completely useless probably out on the job. It was probably more of a liability for my dad than anything else, but it got me around and learning a little bit more about that stuff. So I really enjoyed those memories. Just, I wish they lasted a little bit more, and I wish I was there to be able to be by his side a little bit more, but on the other jobs. But yeah, so how much work as a younger guy did you, like, how long did you work with him on those? You mentioned 8 or 10 years old, but as you were going into high school and stuff, were you still working on the job with him there too?
Yeah, like I said, like you brought up when I was younger, 8, 9, 10, and we were probably more in the way that we're actually helping. But I at least got exposed to that a little bit as I got older. So I think as I got into maybe junior high or high school, I worked with him during the summers in like one of the painting the crew members. And so like I was actually working with the other guys on this crew and quite a few summers doing that. It wasn't until I was a little bit older and a little bit farther in high school when I wanted to try and start getting jobs in a different field and doing something else at the time that I stopped working with them like that kind of full time during the summers. And it was mainly just during the summers because it didn't really make sense if I was off school or something like that.
Mm-hmm. What did that do for your guys' relationship between you and your dad?
I don't know if I've ever thought it in that respect, but it probably allowed us to be able to spend more time together, at least during the summer. He was busy because he ran a painting company, multiple jobs and stuff like that. But there's a lot of times where if we were going to be going to work at the same time and leaving at the same time, especially earlier on before I could drive, where I'd have to ride with him every day to work and back. And so we had to spend the time in the truck to and from work. He spent a little bit of time on the job site. It's probably not as much on the job site. So I think it was a decent amount of quality time that I wouldn't have got had I not been going to work with him during those summers.
Yeah, that was one of those that I try to include the kids, and I'm a very logical, and I try to be super efficient with what I'm doing, which does not really work out when you're bringing kids with you most of the time. Like I just bought a big diesel truck and I'm trying to play around with it. It's an older Excursion. I'm putting in a new turbo and I put in a new rear differential stuff. I'm just rebuilding a bunch of stuff in it. So I started bringing the kids out and I'm thinking to myself, and I told my wife, I said, this is logically makes no sense to bring the kids with me, but I homeschool them now. So I was like, I can make this as part of our homeschool stuff. But I was reading a book recently and I got to remember the name of it. I'm going to try to look it up without being too distracted while doing it. But the book was talking about trying to be more Habits of the Household. There it is. So it's Habits of the Household by Justin Early. He was talking about applying different habits in your life. And there are times where including your kids in those moments, it gives you that moment, just like you were saying, to really connect with your kids on a different level. Does it make actual sense to bring them to help you work things? No. Is it going to take you more time? Yes. Is it going to be more frustration for you? Oh yeah, probably. But the connection you get to make, that's one of the reasons I asked, is I didn't get to do that with my dad very often. He became a correction officer when I was younger. He was in the Air Force for a while and then he broke his back. And then those odd jobs in between the Air Force and corrections is the only time I really got to spend with him like one-on-one. And man, I missed that. So I'm trying to remind myself now, take the kids, go with you, work on the truck. Is it more of a pain? Yeah, sure. Like I was underneath the truck and they were like handing me bolts, right? For those just listening, I was definitely doing air quotes because it wasn't all that great of a job. But man, they got to be around with me a lot more. And I got to teach them about working with your hands, and they're climbing all over the truck. We're having a great time. But are there memories like that when you were a kid? Because I'm hoping that I'm like passing some of those memories on, that they really remember doing these things with dad. What are some of your more memorable moments with your father as you were growing up? And what do you think those are tied to, or why do you think those are more memorable for you?
I think for me, obviously looking back, a lot of the time that I spent with him was doing the work stuff, but some of the most memorable moments I have, which has definitely translated to my life today, is we had a little cabin and we used to get away. When I was raised, we came from pretty modest means, right? We couldn't really afford to go on vacations and do stuff like that. But we had this cabin up in the mountains, and so we used to spend a ton of time up at the cabin in the mountains, and that's where we go fishing and do that kind of just get away. Mm-hmm. Man, those were probably some of the best memories that I had growing up with my dad, my family, just getting away and being up at the cabin and fishing or fly fishing, doing that kind of stuff. Mm-hmm. And that's definitely something that I remember as a child and trying to carry through today with my family. And that was probably the biggest one for me.
What is going on, everybody? Welcome to the BizDad podcast. Today, I am very excited to talk to Tony Johnson, another GoBundance member, and he and I got the pleasure of hanging out. Our family's hanging out at FamBundance a couple weeks ago up in Vermont, which was awesome. We had a great time doing all of that. But I'm really looking forward to getting to know Tony on a different level and introducing him to all of you. But Tony, if you could go ahead and introduce yourself, introduce your family, tell us about who your family is, and then also about your business.
Great, Adam. Thank you so much for having me. I appreciate you. So, Tony Johnson. I am currently a commercial builder. I've been in business since 2007. I am married 17 years right now, about to hit my 18th year in another 2 months. I have 4 children, 1 boy, 3 girls. My oldest is 15, Lucas. Then I have a 14-year-old daughter, Lily. Then I have an 11-year-old daughter, Lainey, and a 6-year-old daughter, Logan. So we're a lot of L's in the family, but fun little family, and love to hang out with my kids and do fun stuff together.
Let's actually talk about what it was that you saw growing up. Tell us a little bit about your dad, maybe even your dad's dad, or what it was like growing up in your family.
I have a kind of optimal childhood, optimal life. So it was, growing up was very nice. The biggest disadvantage I had in growing up was my dad traveled a lot, so he was gone. My parents were together, loving. I was the youngest of 4 children. So I had 2 older sisters and an older brother. So I felt like I was always taken care of, always following my siblings around. And being the 4th child, I luckily had, my parents had experienced everything. So everything I went through, they were more laid back and had gone through all the trials and tribulations with my older siblings. And I watched them scream, lose control with them. But with me, they were very easygoing, gentle, kind, and very supportive. So obviously, I think the youngest child gets the best. And I was lucky enough to be raised in a family where my parents stayed together. They were loving. We went to church every week. So we had good morals. I had a good compass from them on what was right and what was wrong. And realistically, I had great childhood, until I was a junior in high school when my other siblings had already moved out and we relocated. And that was a difficult time past the final 2 years before I went to college because of that transition. But beyond that, my childhood was great. Only thing that I found as I looked back, as I got older, was my dad was gone a lot. So he was always at my sporting events and doing those things, but he was never a dad that said, I love you. So he never told me he loved me as a kid, even though I knew he did, just wasn't his personality. And he never did anything like played sports with me. So I can count on one hand how many times we threw a football, played baseball or whatever. It was like 4 times in my childhood.
Yeah.
But he was a great role model of a father and guided me in all the principles in life and how to be a good, upstanding human being and a good man. I learned all of that from him.
Wow. What was it like for him growing up? Do you know much about his dad?
So he grew up, his parents, he grew up in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, and he was the younger of 2 boys, and his was a bit of an odd situation. So his older brother, his whole life, never moved out of his parents' house. I lived with his mother and father, never dated, never did anything, just lived in there. And my father was a straight A student, got a scholarship to college, was an electrical engineer, did great, and moved all around and worked his way up the corporate ladder. But as a child, they would go hunting. They're avid hunters. They would have a hunting cabin and would go fishing and hunting all the time in a small town. He grew up golfing and was a caddy for all the golfers. Those were his things that he really focused on growing up. Besides that, it was just a lot of school, and he did a little drinking and whatever else, but pretty relaxed childhood and a good childhood. Parents were normal. His father was a builder. So we go back in generations with my family with builders. So that's something I take as a trait from his father.
Do you know how involved his dad was in his life growing up?
He didn't travel. He was, as I was saying, he was a builder, so he was always around. So I would say that they had a good relationship. We haven't gone in depth until his father died. They spoke at least once a week, and he was, comparative to his older brother, he was the one that his father would ask for advice because my dad was way more organized, way more educated than his own father. So yeah, he was a leader of us and a leader to his own family. My dad, I know they had a great relationship from when I was aware and conscious of it. And he lived the longest of all my grandparents. So I knew him the best. He was a great grandfather, great man, really nice. And they got along great his whole life.
That's awesome. That's great to hear. Yeah, it's one of those that you can't really tell what somebody's going to turn out to be, even looking at their parents. But it's always interesting to talk back to where those times were as our fathers were growing up and who their dads were, and just understand our lineage and on how it's been rolling down. Well, hello everybody. Welcome to the BizDad podcast. Today I am actually very excited to talk to Josh Notes. But Josh, if you can, please tell us all a little bit about who you are, who your family is, and what your business is.
Thank you for having me and all the listeners out there. So Josh Notes. Family is myself and my wife, Jen, are leaders of our family here. And we've got Nathan, age 10, Annabelle, age 8, and Gavin's going to turn 6 here in just a couple months. And I got a dog named Wally.
The old dog named Wally. You can't leave Wally out, not on my notes. Okay.
And then on the business side, serial entrepreneur. I'm sure we'll get into other ventures, but right now my main focus is sustain CFO, provide fractional CFO services to small, medium, growing businesses. And then I have a collective of energy businesses, EFW, Energy, Food and Water. The Energy Artisans is our guild, and we develop clean energy assets in the Mid-Atlantic of the United States.
Awesome. Yeah, right. I knew a little bit about that, but I'm going to have to ask a few more questions because I don't know a ton about that. And that's going to be interesting. Before we dive too much into all of that stuff, tell me a little bit about what it was like growing up, who your dad was, what it was like having him as a father. Yeah, just dive into that a little bit.
Great. Okay. Born into an entrepreneurial family. It wasn't ever expressed that way, but looking back on it, oh, no wonder how I ended up here. So I was born in the foothills of San Francisco in a small little mountain town called Boulder Creek. My mom and dad, I'm going to call them hippies. I don't think they will be upset about hearing that. My dad was late to the hippie party. He was born in 1942. My mom was born in 1950. They met in a hot tub and got married about 5 days later. So that's about as hippie as it gets. And growing up, it was, my mom was, and she pretty much went down as one of the longest serving midwives, certified nurse midwives in the Maryland area. And my dad was an entrepreneur who jumped in and out of business ventures and started his own thing. And then he would go and work for the government for a period of time and cycle back through. But I had a lot of freedom growing up. We moved to the East Coast because of a business failure and some politics in the midwifery world when I was about 5. So really grew up here in between Baltimore and DC. I have an older brother, Zach, and we just had a ton of freedom to try things out, including starting businesses. I'm sure we'll get into that, but
That's awesome. So you mentioned your dad do a business and go into government, do a business. What was that back and forth? How did that work? And what was your view from a young age on what that meant to you guys?
I don't know if I really recognized it probably until I was like about, before that, he had some software ventures. He's so early in the computer game that they just called it math. But he was using early stage computing in government and was having some pretty cool wins. But unfortunately for the family wealth, it was all in the name of government. So as an example of that, he created what's called the postman's algorithm. And so what that did was it revamped the entire postal service to make it more efficient. And what he figured out was that taking right turns would cut about 25% of the driving out of the routes of the postal service. So cool story, saved $10 billion for the government annually in the 1960s and went on to do a bunch of other things in defense. But the business he started in California was like a Microsoft Visio. So it's like building blocks of code that you could build software applications on. He was early, as he has been with each of his ventures, and he pretty well sucked at marketing. And so that's why these businesses usually tended not to work. And then money would get tight. And my mom didn't make a ton of money because she was serving the undocumented population of women up and down the California coast and delivering babies and collecting what she could. But things were tight. But I never felt like scared about money. But it was also like, hey, if she wants some money, go out there and work for it. So once we came to the East Coast, it started snowing. I remember first early ventures were like shoveling, raking leaves, like all those early neighborhood ventures.
Awesome. Yeah, those are the same ones that I did growing up, at least at those types of ages, junior high and whatnot, in upstate New York. It was like, yeah, that's what you do. You rake leaves, prepare for the snow, and then you go shovel, and you go bounce from house to house, and you go shovel. It's funny, I never really looked at those as entrepreneurial things until I started being an entrepreneur. It was like, yeah, of course, like that makes total sense. I went out and was trying to work my butt off for myself to be able to earn money, to be able to do what I wanted, but I joined the military right out of high school. So it was one of those, had I realized what I was doing, maybe I wouldn't have. I'm happy the way my life turned out, so I can't complain too often much. But when you were growing up and you were saying, hey, you were exposed to the entrepreneurial stuff, you started doing some of that yourself. How did that go through high school and then into college? How did your progression into entrepreneurship and being a serial entrepreneur kind of meld?
So the first thing, that I reflect on is just that it was never... there was never like I was told like, you're going to go to college, you're getting good grades, you're going to go to college, we'll figure it out. Like finances was something we had to figure out, but it wasn't, you're going to go to college and then you're going to get a job. It was, you're going to go to college, figure out some specialty, and then you'll figure out how to use that in the world. And so I think it wasn't a push towards entrepreneurship, but it was an open door, and it allowed for a lot of exploration. And at a young age, when I started experimenting in it, even I got into some trouble we'll talk about, it's fun trouble to talk about, but my parents weren't like, you're bad. They were like, okay, what'd you learn? What do you do next time different? Okay, the first one that really, so my brother and I were starting these landscaping related businesses, and we got into a fight, like a fist fight over, it was kind of I think it was raking leaves. Who's going to rake like the last portion of the leaves? And anyway, the client kind of came out, was like, I'm not paying you, get out of my yard. We're like bleeding all over. And my mom, we came back home, we were still yelling about it. And she was just like, okay. If she didn't take her rakes away or anything like that. But I do remember when we left the house, it was maybe a year or two later to go do snow shoveling. We didn't shovel their walkway first. And she was pissed she was not happy because we took her shovels, her cost of goods, and we didn't perform for the material supplier. And so she ended up shoveling it like with this like old broken one and hurt her wrist. And I remember that was the first time when I was like, okay, like I need to respect my supply chain. Accelerate forward into middle school. A really good friend named Matej. He was the foreign kid from Slovakia, and he didn't speak much English, but he was a year older just because of the way the school year lined up with his birthday. So he got a job at Dunkin' Donuts, and they had a new policy that you weren't allowed to give away the donuts. You had to throw them away because some homeless person had gotten sick from eating donuts out of a trash can or something. So he starts bringing these donuts like by the box. And first he's like at our lunch table and like we're all buying from them. And there's this line kind of forming. And on like week 2, getting out of hand, lines get really long. And I'm like, hey, dude, do you need any help? And he's, yeah, man, like, I don't know what to do. Like, I'm out of locker space. I'm like, I don't really use my locker. Like, you can use my locker. And I was like, I think you could get more people through the line if I pre-collected the order and the money, and then you just serve them and keep them happy and get the order for tomorrow. And he was like, dude, that's great. So we like doubled revenue. We ended up having to alter the way that the line flowed for the regular lunch line. And we ended up bringing on this other guy. He was like the kid who went through puberty first. And he was like our security. His name was Brian. I won't give up his last name in case he's listening, but he taught us a really interesting lesson about company culture and about how you treat your customers in HR, because the line got real long and the principal were allowing this to happen. But then one day the vice principal, Miss McGowan, I hope she is listening, she came and she asked for a bear claw, like up in the front of line. And Brian told her, you need to get in line with everybody else. And that was the last day we were in that business. Well, got pulled into the office, got our moms called. We had made like all this money in quarters, hundreds of dollars. And the funny thing was, which it reflects back on like values, is I didn't even care about the money. It was just fun. It was fun to hustle. It was fun to try to problem solve on the fly. And I think that's carried forward into kind of everything I've done since.
That's hilarious.